Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you case number 120 in the best way to do cataract surgery series. This is a Catarock, and you're going to see double chop, cross chop, and scissoring chop, which is another modification of a technique I've developed. Scissoring chop is used to amputate the posterior adhesions, and essentially you're using the chop force almost kind of like a scissor. If you imagine a scissor, it's a sideways chop basically. So it's still horizontal, but you're chopping from kind of almost like a diagonal chop, and you'll see when I do the maneuver. But it's really to use when you're amputating the posterior adhesions, when you have a posterior plate phenomenon. So this is the cataract. It's pretty dense. I'm using the cotton tip to steady the eye. I'm using a corneal marker, which will help me to center incisor-rhexis. I'm making my paracentesis incision first on the right side and then the left side. Make sure the incision is parallel to the iris plane, which creates a nice corneal shelf, which will allow me to achieve a self-sealing incision. I'm going to inject some intracameral lidocaine, and then some intracameral epinephrine, and then some dispersive viscoelastic to coat the cornea and flatten out the anterior capsule. And this is a triplanar corneal incision. I make a vertical groove, place the blade into the deep part of the groove, tunnel through the cornea, turning the eye towards me, and then I enter. And this creates a really nice self-sealing incision. I push some more viscoelastic to flatten the anterior capsule, and these are the Haldane-Perkar forceps again. Again, the teeth come together not like tongs, but more like scissors. They're on top of each other, which provides a thinner profile. We try to carefully puncture the center. Don't want to push down too much. Again, these tips are not that sharp, and so I just want to be very careful when I do this. So I go ahead and it does actually puncture through, and I grab the tear and I come around. I was able to extend the tear to about the radius that I want for the capsulotomy. Again, I use that corneal mark as a guide. Going around circumferentially very carefully. As you can see, not significant zonulopathy, but I'm just being mindful of that. And grabbing and regrabbing, not much forces trying to radialize in this case. And so this was uneventful. And so this is the capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I place a cannula under the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, point the tip down, get a nice wave, turn the tip back up, decompress on the left side, placing the tip on the right side, hooking it downward, and you can see the lens begins to spin nicely here. Irrigate the surface of the cornea, lifting the incision with a chopper, going in with irrigation off to minimize Descemet's trauma, removing the surface epinuclear material. Again, this is a fairly dense lens, but I'm going to go ahead and try to perform a double chop maneuver without sculpting here. Place the chopper under the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally, gripping the lens on both sides. As I bring the instruments together, you see the whitening of the lens. It fractures the lens in half. I'm trying to spread as I go, spreading and spreading, spreading and spreading, spreading and spreading. I'm going to rotate the lens one time, placing the chopper around the lens, performing the double chop one more time, getting into that trench, and now you can see the lens is completely bisected. Placing the chopper around the right heminucleus, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip. The phaco tip is placed deep within the lens material, and it fractures the right heminucleus in half. Placing the chopper around that first quadrant, using some vacuum to hold the lens, bisecting that first quadrant in half. Because this is a big lens, you have to create a little bit of space. So you can see I'm using a little vacuum to lift that first piece up. And this is that scissoring maneuver I'm telling you about. I lift that piece up and I'm amputating the posterior adhesion of that lens piece. And I do that by turning the chopper sideways. So now that one piece is up, Going to go ahead and grab that second piece of the first quadrant with some vacuum, and then using crushing forces with the instruments and emulsifying the lens piece. You can see how brown and yellow this lens piece is. I'm using sparing amounts of ultrasonic energy, but this is clearly a dense piece of cataract. You can't just aspirate these pieces, they're quite dense. Placing the chopper around the second quadrant, pulling it centrally toward the fingertip, dividing that lens piece, once again, separating it, using some vacuum to grab that one piece, getting around it. Again, this is that sideways chop, amputating that piece from the rest of the lens, crushing the piece into smaller pieces, and emulsifying the lens piece. You're just really kind of trying to create more space by getting rid of each of these small pieces. Using some vacuum to grab that piece again. Again, using a sideways chop, scissoring chop, holding the chopper sideways and crushing it. By getting sideways, you're able to amputate the posterior adhesions to the lens material there. So now that first heminucleus is out, I rotate the second heminucleus in front of me, place the chopper around the lens, placing the fingertip deep in the bag, crushing and bisecting that second heminucleus in half, separating the two pieces, making sure the two are fully separated without any adhesions, placing the chopper around that third quadrant, and trying to crush the lens in half between the instruments. And that's a free piece now, using some vacuum to try to control it, and then positioning the instrument so I'm able to crush the lens piece in half, using some vacuum again to control the piece, and then crushing the next piece into smaller pieces with the instruments. And I just keep doing that into smaller and smaller pieces. Because these pieces are quite dense, I'm not just going pedal to the metal, I break the pieces into smaller and smaller pieces, and when they're small enough, I go ahead and emulsify the lens piece. This is the last quadrant. Place the chopper around the lens piece, trying to get around it. I'm rotating my hand so it's able to hook the lens a little bit better. I'm able to cut the lens in half. Again, positioning the instruments around the lens piece, which again requires some practice. And once you get used to it, you start to develop a kind of a nice technique where you're able to control the piece and just crush it between the instruments. But this does take some time. And again, I always do surgery as if I'm doing surgery on a loved one, whether it's my mom, my dad, myself. I want to do the surgery the best way that I can, and that means minimal ultrasonic energy equals minimal trauma to the corneal endothelium, minimal potential trauma and posterior capsule rupture risk. And so I'm very, very careful when I do cataract surgery. And even though it takes a little bit longer, to me, this is the best way to do cataract surgery. So again, there's some small pieces here. I'm gingerly crushing the pieces into smaller pieces and then activating vacuum only once I have the chopper deep to protect the posterior capsule. So I crush, 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 and then position the chopper deep. And when I do that, I'm using some vacuum and the little pulse of ultrasonic energy to remove those small little fragments. And those little fragments are like shards. They're really, really dense. There's a little fragment at the incision. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the fingertip out, and I go in with the iron handpiece. I always start sub-incisionally, starting from anterior to posterior, peeling the cortex off. By doing it this way, it's a cleaner removal of the cortex with less of those fine cortical wisps. Switch to polish mode, polishing underneath the rhexis edge and removing the lens epithelial cells. Go ahead and pulse BSS into subincisional capsular fornix, which is clean here. and then push some cohesive viscoelastic to fill the capsular bag, and then using the sweeper to polish underneath the rhexis edge on the left side, and then the right side. Go ahead and inject the single piece acrylic lens into the capsular bag, making sure the leading edge goes into the bag. As the lens unfolds, I quickly transition to the INA. I place it in, activate irrigation once I'm in the eye, making sure the eye is inflated. Going underneath the optic, tilting it and rotating it 90 degrees clockwise, removing all the viscoelastic from within the bag. Polishing under the rhexis edge again, removing the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber, and then I'll hydrate my incisions. So again, this is a fairly dense lens. I'm able to perform double chop, cross chop. I was able to fracture the lens completely without having to sculpt. So again, this is not one of those super dense cataracts, but it's a fairly dense cataract nonetheless. And I'm able to do the scissoring chop maneuver. Again, you saw that I rotated the chopper sideways, so the chopper, instead of pointing down, was parallel to the iris plane, and I was able to get around the lens piece that was still adherent to the cataract, the rest of the cataract piece, and I was able to do a scissoring maneuver, a sideways chop, amputating those posterior adhesions so I can separate those fragments from the entire bulk of the lens and little by little remove those small fragments. So this is really kind of the most efficient way I've noticed to be able to break those posterior adhesions without trying to just grab it. Because if you try to grab it with ultrasonic energy, all you do is you just bite into it, and you have this kind of like a adhesion of almost like a flower where the petals are all separated, but it's all connected in the central core. And so in order to separate for the central core, the scissoring chop is really a really nice technique, elegant, very controlled. You can amputate the pieces and go after them one by one. As you can see, the CDE was fairly low relative to this dense cataract, and as a result, this patient had a nice clear cornea post-op day 1. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.